Welcome back to the deep dive, where we really get into the source material, roll up our sleeves, and today's deep dive is all about a chapter on public speaking. You might be thinking public speaking not really my thing, but trust me, this deep dive is going to uncover some techniques that you can apply to any type of communication.
Yeah.
Whether you're presenting to a boardroom or just chatting with friends, we're talking about the power of tempo.
Ooh, tempo.
And I like it.
You've probably heard of tempo in music, but this deep dive takes us beyond the musical realm. Think of tempo as the pace or speed of something, and how that pace can be used to create certain effects. Imagine the slow, deliberate tempo of an ox cart hauling cargo versus the rapid tempo of a bullet train zipping across the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great starting point. I mean, the chapter defines tempo simply as rate of movement. And it makes this really fascinating comparison between old muzzle-loading guns that took ages to reload and modern rapid-fire weapons.
Oh, wow.
It really highlights how tempo can completely change the dynamic of an action. Absolutely, and a communication tempo is the secret weapon for sounding more natural and engaging. Just like a musician uses tempo changes to create different moods, a speaker can use tempo to keep their audience captivated.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating is that the key to mastering this natural tempo isn't about learning a set of rules, but about observing how people talk in everyday, well-bred conversation. It's like a writer crafting believable dialogue. You want to capture that natural rhythm and flow of speech.
Okay, so it's not about mimicking it's more about capturing the essence of how people naturally speak. This chapter gives a really interesting example. Imagine you're saying, I can't recall what I did with my knife. Oh, now I remember. I gave it to Mary.
Mm.
See how those subtle tempo changes create a more natural flow?
Yeah, it's like it gives it that sort of human element. It's not just like a robot reading off a script.
Right.
It's much more engaging.
And it's not just about sounding natural. Varying your tempo is also a key strategy to fight monotony and keep things lively.
Right. I mean, imagine a song where every note is the same length, or a car stuck in one gear.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be very exciting, would it? Think about how, skilled speakers use a technique called tempo rubato. It's like slightly speeding up or slowing down to create a sense of conversational flow, almost like a musical improvisation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
This chapter is a really cool example of how even birds instinctively understand this. Even a canary's song is full of tempo shifts and variations, creating a dynamic and beautiful melody. They're like tiny feathered maestros.
Yeah, it's amazing how, even in nature, we see these principles at play.
Yeah, that's really cool. Now, here's where tempo gets really powerful. Those big shifts in tempo act like attention magnets, naturally emphasizing what you're saying.
It's true. Think of a train suddenly slowing down. You can't help but notice it, right? It grabs your attention. The same principle applies to speaking.
Yeah. I'm starting to see how powerful this can be. There's this awesome example in the text, a line from a play. I don't want you to forget what I said. I want you to remember it the longest day you will. I don't care if you've got 6 guns. The speaker starts slow and then, bam, speeds up, just as the other character whips out a revolver. Whoa. Talk about adding drama.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's like punctuation. It's like emphasizing a certain point
Think so.
with your voice.
Yeah.
But of course, like any tool, it's important to use the right tempo for the right emotion. You wouldn't want to deliver a simple statement with the same intensity as a dramatic climax. It would just come across as, well, a bit much.
Right. So it's all about finding the right balance. This chapter emphasizes that you shouldn't be afraid to experiment and play around with tempo to see what feels right. It even points out that reversing the tempo instructions for an excerpt called The Mob doesn't completely ruin its meaning, which shows there's a certain amount of flexibility.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not always about rigid rules. It's more about kind of developing a sense of what works best.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, there are some passages that require a specific tempo to truly shine. Like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, for instance.
Oh, absolutely.
The chapter also includes an excerpt from the poem Barefoot Boy, which wouldn't have the same emotional impact if delivered at a fast, frantic pace. But overall, the takeaway here is what the chapter calls shotgun tempo, a mix of fast and slow speeds, just like a perfectly seasoned dish.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Shotgun tempo. That's a good one. So to master the shotgun tempo, try this. Before a key point, slow down and lower your voice slightly. Then deliver the point with a faster pace and slightly higher pitch. This contrast will make your message pop. It's like adding a dash of chili powder to a recipe to give it that extra kick.
That's a great tip. And speaking of extra kicks, this deep dive is just getting started. We've explored the basic concepts of tempo, and now we're going to take it to the next level and see how it applies in the real world. We'll be right back after a quick.
Ooh, getting spicy.
Yeah.
I like it.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Okay, sounds good. Welcome back. So before the break, we were laying the groundwork, understanding the power of tempo in communication. But you might be wondering, like, how does all of this translate to everyday conversations? Those interactions we have outside of formal speeches or presentations?
That's a great question, and this chapter really got me thinking about that too. And honestly, I think understanding tempo can make us all more effective communicators,
Yeah.
even in those casual day-to-day exchanges.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Those natural tempo shifts we discussed earlier, that speeding up and slowing down, those well-placed pauses, I mean, they happen all the time in casual conversation. And they're a big part of what makes a chat feel engaging and dynamic.
Yeah, that's so true. I never really thought about it that way before. It's like we instinctively know how to use tempo, but we just haven't been consciously aware of it.
Exactly, yeah. A truly captivating storyteller, for example, probably isn't speaking at the same pace the whole time. They're speeding up during exciting parts, slowing down for emphasis, maybe even pausing for dramatic effect. It's almost like they're painting a picture with their words, using tempo to create like light and shadow, texture and depth.
And the chapter actually touches on how tempo can be used to convey emotion,
Mm-hmm.
which is fascinating. Like when we're excited or anxious, we naturally speak faster. And when we're sad or thoughtful, we tend to slow down. It's like our emotions have their own internal tempo that influences how we express ourselves.
It's true. And it brings up another really important point, the importance of being aware of our own tempo and how it might be perceived by others.
Right, because if we're constantly rushing through our words, it might make us seem impatient or dismissive. And on the flip side, speaking too slowly could make us sound unsure or hesitant.
Yeah, for sure. It's all about finding that sweet spot, that Goldilocks tempo that feels just right for the situation and the message we're trying to convey. And remember, it's not just about the speed of our words. Pauses and silence can be just as powerful as spoken words, especially when used strategically.
I've always admired speakers who can use silence effectively. A well-placed pause can create suspense. Give the listener time to absorb information, or simply emphasize a point. It's like the breath between musical notes, allowing the sound to resonate and linger in the air.
Yes, exactly. And speaking of music, this whole conversation has really highlighted the deep connection between music and language for me. Both rely on rhythm, tempo, and dynamics to create meaning and evoke emotions. It's almost as if they're two sides of the same coin, two different but deeply interconnected ways of using sound to communicate and connect.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And it makes me think that just as a conductor guides an orchestra to create a harmonious symphony, we can learn to kind of conduct our own speech, using tempo and other vocal techniques to craft a more impactful and engaging message.
Yeah, what a powerful image. And this brings up a really practical question. How can our listeners start applying these tempo insights in their own lives?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. What are some concrete steps they can take?
Well, I think simply becoming more aware of tempo is a fantastic starting point. Pay attention to how people use tempo in conversations, in speeches, even in movies and TV shows. Notice how it affects the emotional impact of what they're saying.
Yeah, it's like training your ear to hear the music of language, to pick up on those subtle shifts and variations in tempo that create such a powerful effect.
Exactly. And once you start paying attention, you can begin experimenting with your own tempo. Try
Yeah.
consciously speeding up or slowing down at certain points in your speech. See how it feels, how it changes the way your message comes across.
And don't be afraid to play around with pauses. Sometimes that silence can speak volumes, adding weight and emphasis to your words. Remember, it's all about finding what feels natural and authentic to you. Using tempo as a tool to enhance your own unique communication style.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. The goal isn't to become a robotic speaker who's perfectly controlling every tempo shift. It's about using tempo as a tool to enhance your natural communication style and connect with your audience on a deeper level.
Speaking of connecting with an audience, this chapter mentions some amazing examples of how tempo has been used effectively in some of history's most powerful speeches.
You're talking about those fiery orations that rallied nations to action, speeches that stirred the soul and changed the course of history.
Exactly. Like Senator Thurston's plea for intervention in Cuba.
Ah, that's a perfect example. Thurston's speech is filled with dramatic tempo changes that amplify the emotional impact of his words. He masterfully uses tempo to build a sense of urgency and moral outrage, then shifts gears to create moments of reflection and somber contemplation. It's a masterclass in using tempo to control the emotional arc of a speech. Let me see if I can find that excerpt.
Please do. I'd love to hear how it sounds.
Okay, here it is. Listen to this passage and pay attention to how Thurston uses tempo to build a sense of urgency and moral outrage. The time for action has come. No greater reason for it can exist tomorrow than exists today. Every hour's delay only adds another chapter to the awful story of misery and death. Notice how he slows down and emphasizes certain phrases, like every hour's delay. It really drives home the gravity of the situation.
I can almost hear the clock ticking as he says those words. It creates such a powerful sense of immediacy.
And then he follows that slow, deliberate section with a rapid-fire call to action. Only one power can intervene the United States of America. Ours is the one great nation in the world, the mother of American republics. She holds a position of trust and responsibility toward the peoples and affairs of the whole Western Hemisphere. It's like he's building a wave of momentum, leading the audience toward an inevitable conclusion.
And it works. You can practically feel the energy and conviction building with each phrase.
And then he shifts gears again, slowing down and speaking in a more somber tone. Against the intervention of the United States in this holy cause, there is but one voice of dissent. That voice is the voice of the money changers. They fear war.
Wow. That sudden shift in tempo creates a stark contrast, highlighting the moral conflict at the heart of the issue. It's as if he's shining a spotlight on the forces that stand in opposition to what he believes is right.
Exactly. Thurston masterfully uses tempo to control the emotional arc of his speech, drawing the audience into his narrative and compelling them to action. And while we may not all be delivering speeches on the world stage, this same principle can be applied to everyday communication, making our conversations more engaging and impactful.
Yeah, it's like having a secret weapon in our communication arsenal, a way to add depth, nuance, and emotional resonance to our words.
And the best part is, it's a weapon that's available to everyone. All it takes is a little awareness and a willingness to experiment. Now, I don't know about you, but all this talk about tempo and powerful speeches has left me feeling a bit parched.
Me too. All this deep diving is thirsty work. But before we grab a drink, we have one more segment to explore. We've seen how tempo works on the grand stage, but we still need to uncover some of the more subtle ways it shapes our everyday communication. Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been uncovering the hidden power of tempo, from the grand stage of history-making speeches to the everyday conversations that fill our lives.
And before the break, we were discussing how tempo can be used to evoke emotions and add impact to our words. But there's another fascinating layer to this we haven't touched on yet. The way a tempo creates a sense of rhythm and flow in our communication.
That's intriguing. Tell me more about this rhythmic aspect of tempo.
Well, think about poetry for a moment. Poets often use meter and rhyme to create a rhythmic pattern, and it's this pattern that enhances the beauty and impact of the words.
That's a great point. And isn't that what we're doing with tempo and speech? Creating a rhythmic flow that makes our words more engaging and memorable. It's almost like we're composing music with our voices.
Precisely. A skilled speaker who understands tempo can create a hypnotic effect. That keeps the audience captivated. Just as a good poem draws you in with its rhythmic cadence, a speaker who masters tempo can weave a tapestry of sound that holds the listener's attention.
This is blowing my mind. So it's not just about speeding up or slowing down. It's about using tempo to create a sense of musicality in our speech. It's like we're conductors leading an orchestra of words.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And one of the best ways to develop this sense of rhythmic flow is to practice reading aloud.
You mean like actually reading a book or a poem out loud?
Exactly, but not just reading it in a monotone. Try to find the natural rhythm of the words, emphasizing certain syllables, pausing at appropriate moments, and varying your tempo to match the mood and tone of the passage. Think of it as bringing the words to life, infusing them with your own personal rhythm and style.
That's a great tip. It's like turning reading into a performance, where you're not just conveying the words, but also embodying their emotional essence.
That's exactly right. Because when we speak, we're not just conveying information, we're also engaging in a form of artistry. We're using our voices to paint pictures, evoke emotions, and tell stories.
So the next time I'm reading a bedtime story to my kids, I should channel my inner Shakespeare.
Well, maybe not quite Shakespeare, but you get the idea. Don't be afraid to have fun with it and let your voice dance with the words. Experiment with different tempos, rhythms, and pauses. See what feels natural and expressive.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of tempo,
Sure.
what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, the biggest takeaway is that tempo is a powerful tool we can all use to become more effective and engaging communicators. It's not just about speaking faster or slower, it's about being mindful of the rhythm and flow of our words and using tempo to create emphasis, convey emotion, and captivate our audience.
And remember, the best way to master tempo is to practice. Pay attention to how others use it. Experiment with your own voice. And don't be afraid to have some fun with it. Think of it as a lifelong exploration, a journey into the musicality of language.
Absolutely. And keep in mind that tempo is just one aspect of effective communication. There's a whole symphony of vocal techniques out there waiting to be explored.
Well said. So, dear listeners, go forth and experiment with tempo. You might be surprised at how much it can transform your communication, both on stage and in everyday life.
And who knows, you might even discover a hidden talent for oratory or storytelling.
Now that's a thought to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of tempo. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive, where we explore the depths of knowledge, one source at a time.